Hey, you remember back in Unit 2 when we talked about the First Great Awakening? Well, apparently many Americans went ahead and fell back asleep with reference to their souls, and that means it's time to wake their crap all the way up yet again. That's right, it's time for the Second Great Awakening, so if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Okay, now remember a few videos ago when we talked about the market revolution and the expansion of voting rights, which fundamentally changed the US economy and society and politics? And by the way, the only acceptable answer to that question is a hearty heck yes, because I'm not going to cover it again. Well, those developments also created the conditions for a massive religious revival in the first half of the 19th century known as the Second Great Awakening. And I don't know about you, but that just makes me want to cinch up my comparison pants and see how that relates to the First Great Awakening. And because I'm feeling sassy, let's start with the similarities. So both Great Awakenings were mass religious movements that spread throughout much of the American territory. And as such, they both provided Americans with a common experience and religious vocabulary that served to unite people from different regions. Additionally, both movements spawned new Christian denominations while also spurring the growth of existing denominations, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. But now let's consider the differences. So, preachers in the First Great Awakening were overwhelmingly Calvinist and emphasized individual sin and individual conversion. In fact, according to preachers like Jonathan Edwards, each individual person was born in sin and therefore was so wretched and sinful that their hearts are evil and black all the way to the bottom. And so without a powerful religious conversion to the way of Christ, the human being is in no way capable of making a choice that qualifies as good or right. You know, I'm not a Christian, but even so, I think I'll have an egg salad sandwich for lunch.
Apart from Christ's intervention, your sandwich besmirches the glory of God, you black-hearted turd.
Anyway, all that meant for the most part that the First Great Awakening had precious little to say about making society a better place to live. I mean, if only a few elect Christians were ever going to make it to heaven anyway, you might as well just let the glory besmirching sandwich munchers go down in flames. But in the Second Great Awakening, which lasted roughly 50 years from 1790 to 1840, preachers emphasized more of the innate goodness of human beings and their capacity to choose to live holy lives. And that meant that this movement focused far more on societal reformation as the outflow of religious conversion. And the big difference here is that preachers in this awakening believed and preached that Christians, by their efforts of social reform, could actually bring the perfection of the kingdom of God to earth. And so this religious movement, not surprisingly, spurred an endless number of groups and voluntary organizations that tried to make American society a better place to live and rid the land of its communal sins. Okay, now before I get into the causes of this religious revival, it may be that your APUSH grade needs a little reviving of its own. And for that, let me introduce you to my APUSH Heimler review guide. It has everything you need to study as fast as possible so you can get an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May. It's got exclusive whole unit review videos that you're not going to see here on YouTube, note guides to follow along, practice multiple choice questions for each unit, full-length practice exams, and answer keys for every dang bit of it. So if that's the kind of help you need, then get that clicky finger out and check that link in the description. Okay, so let's consider the causes of the Second Great Awakening, and there are no less than 3 of them. First, you have the expansion of democracy. So during this period, more and more Americans believed that they were entitled to participate in the franchise and therefore worked to expand the right to vote from a small elite group of propertied white men to an acceptance of universal white male suffrage. So says you, how does more democracy lead to more spirituality? A fine question, says I, and here's the connection. You see, the Calvinism of the First Great Awakening emphasized the doctrine of predestination, which taught that God had decided before the creation of the world which people would be saved and which would be damned. And the saved, known as the elect, were much smaller in number than the mass of humanity that would be damned. And if that smells a little elitist to you, then your sniffer is working just fine. But in the Second Great Awakening, the doctrine of predestination was almost entirely abandoned, and instead, preachers emphasized the innate goodness of human beings and the possibility of every person to achieve salvation by believing in the gospel and adopting a life of Christian morality. In other words, salvation was now open to all, which was a very democratic notion. And you can see this principle, for example, in the way these revivals took place and who was included. So on the frontier and in rural areas, revivals were organized into camp meetings. These were all-day gatherings in fields where multiple preachers filled the day with emotionally charged sermons interlaced with congregational singing and praying. And as a general rule, many of these preachers had no formal education, which was a big departure from the luminaries of the First Great Awakening like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. Additionally, the crowds that attended the camp meetings were unusually diverse, including whites and blacks, both enslaved and free, as well as women. In fact, in some cases, black preachers and women preachers held the stage and gathered their own followings. As a result, Christian denominations that allowed for such diversity grew rapidly, especially the Baptists and the Methodists. And the Methodists grew especially fast because their preachers were circuit riders, which meant that they traveled throughout a region preaching and seeking converts. And one particularly famous frontier preacher was the Methodist Peter Cartwright, whose circuit ranged from Tennessee to Illinois. And he traveled that circuit on horseback for decades, and by the end of his life, he had traveled by some estimates around 300,000 miles trying to light the fire of Christian conversion. And growing up on the frontier, he had no formal education and thus represents the Second Great Awakening's democratization of faith. Okay, the second cause of the new religious revival was the rise of individualistic beliefs. So, intimately intertwined with the expansion of democracy was the growing belief in the triumph of the individual as the most basic unit of society. And this idea was encouraged through the Transcendentalist movement, which we'll talk a lot more about in the next video. Anyway, one of their main emphases was that a person needed to find his or her own way in the world without submitting to the rules, regulations, and mores of the wider society. And so, Second Great Awakening preachers used the language of individualism to challenge their hearers to have a personalized religious conversion and direct the power of that conversion toward the reformation of society. And then the third cause of the Second Great Awakening was a reaction against rationalism. Now, during the era of independence and the creation of a new government, religious beliefs were kind of sidelined for the triumph of rationalistic beliefs, especially those promoted by Enlightenment thought. For example, Thomas Paine in his book The Age of Reason argued that religious belief and churches were instruments of control and conformity that suffocated people's access to liberty. And so many of the founders channeled their religious instincts into a more rationalistic and less emotional form of belief known as deism. It was a belief that God was something like a cosmic clockmaker who made the world and everything therein as a clock, and then wound it up with the laws of physics and then let it tick away with no further intervention on his part. Therefore, deists rejected any reports of miracles in the Bible, since that would imply that God remained active in the world after the moment of creation. The point is, deism was a belief system that allowed for intellectual assent without any of the emotionalism of prior iterations of the Christian faith. But as the Second Great Awakening began, its preachers rejected that dry intellectualism in favor of highly charged emotional appeals, which was influenced by the same romanticism that produced the highly emotional art forms of the period. Anyway, if preachers like Peter Cartwright lit the fire of revival in rural and frontier areas, Charles Grandison Finney revived the crap out of America's urban population. And he focused much of his effort in Rochester, New York City, and his soaring oratory held crowds spellbound. He made use of highly charged emotional appeals and spoke in plain language filled with metaphors and allusions that common people could understand. And furthermore, Finney's preaching thundered with appeals for Christians to reform society, especially drunkenness and slavery, because in doing so they were ushering in the perfect kingdom of God. Now, the emotionalism of Finney and preachers like him reached its height in what became known as the Burned Over District of Western New York. It was called this because the preachers had converted so many people with their hellfire and brimstone messages that it appeared that there was no one left to convert. And ultimately, this religious movement would set up the entire apparatus for widespread social reform in the next few decades, and I'll talk all about that in the next video. Well, okay, you can click here to watch my other videos for Unit 4, or you can click here to grab my APUSH Heimler review guide, which is going to help you get an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May. I'm really glad you came around, and I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.